Chapter 2. Bluebird had never been entirely happy, either in her marriage or in her life in a camp circle that was not her own. It was not that the people were unkind, quite the contrary, but she could not feel satisfied there. She never ceased to yearn for her own people. It was almost 4 years now she and her grandmother had been staying there. Sometimes she wished they had risked everything and struck out alone in search for their own camp circle. Even if they had perished on the way, it would have been worth trying. Her childhood among her own many loving kinsmen was a happy one, but that time was like a dream vanished. Try as she would, she could never recapture the feeling of that carefree life so cruelly ended in a day. Tonight, for the first time with her infant, Waterlily, asleep beside her, she was again completely happy. This was a different kind of happiness, satisfying, if subdued, but it was good. She lay idly reminiscing in the dark tepee of her cousin, who was out somewhere. With singular detachment, she was able for the first time to recall in detail the events of that tragic day that had robbed her of her family. Tonight it seemed remote, like something that had happened to someone else, long ago, in a faraway place. She had been 14 at the time. Her father had decided to leave the camp circle for a few days of deer hunting because their supply of meat was dwindling fast and no buffalo had been sighted for a long time. He took his wife and his mother and his 3 children, Bluebird and her brothers, 10 and 6 years of age. The family made their temporary camp near a wood and immediately went out to cut the poles and boughs needed to set up their work arrangements, drying racks for the meat, and an arbor of leaves. Soon the father was bringing in deer and other game at such a rate that the 2 women had to work steadily from dawn to dusk, caring for the meat. For they were a frugal family and saved every bit that could be used. But busy as they were, the old grandmother took time out one afternoon for a walk under the tall cottonwoods nearby. The next day she announced as they were eating, "There is a large cache of earth beans over yonder, where many little paths under the matted grass come together from all directions. The field mice, too, have been busy preparing for winter." "Well, that is indeed good news," her son's wife said. "Now maybe we can take back earth beans as well as meat. I hope you can remember where the cache is." "Oh yes, and anyway I set up a stick to mark the spot," the old woman assured her, adding, "I could easily have thumbed in the dirt roof right then and with my club and brought the beans home. But of course I waited." The younger boy, who dearly relished them, pouted. "Oh, grandmother, you should have. Then I could have some beans now." Bluebird cut in. "You can't do that, silly. Don't you know that you have to leave a return gift for the mice when you take away their food? They have to have something to live on, too." That was no way for a girl to speak to a brother. The few adults would fail to correct such a slip. Bluebird's mother said gently but firmly, "Daughter, one does not call one's brother silly." And then she turned to her mother-in-law, saying, "I have some dried corn in the raw hide box. Will it answer?" The old woman was delighted. "Of course. It will be just the thing. Too good, I should say. For who are they to have green corn dried for them? They should be too happy with it to think of bewitching me, I hope." She said this laughingly, but it was plain she half feared the common belief about the powers of resentful mice. Bluebird went with her grandmother to open the cache, and they found an abundance of beans unusually large and meaty. They would cook up rich and sweet, the old woman said. She found more caches and went to work at once, happily drawing out handfuls of the black, earth-caked store and piling it on her blanket, spread out to receive it. For each handful she religiously returned a handful of green corn that had been parboiled and then sun-dried, a treat for the mice indeed. When she was through, she and Bluebird grasped the corners of the blanket and tossed the beans high into the winnow out the dirt. The loose, fine dust was carried off on the breeze. The clumps settled to the bottom and could easily be removed later. The old woman gathered the blanket to form a bag holding the beans and tied a thong around it tightly, bending over. When she straightened up, she groaned a bit over a kink in her back, as was her habit. Then, shielding her eyes with one hand, she studied the sun. "Come, child, we must be going now. It is getting on," she said. But she could not resist hurriedly picking up a few dry sticks. "We can always do with more firewood." She made a bundle of them with the pack strap she always wore for a belt. From a lifetime of practice, she flung the bundle expertly onto her back. At last, she and Bluebird started home, carrying the beans suspended between them. Out of the woods and into the clear they came, but when they looked toward their camp, it was not there. Everything was in ruins. How could it have happened so quickly, so quietly? It was unbelievable that in the short time since Bluebird and her grandmother had left it, an enemy war party had raided their camp. Yet that was the case. The destruction could hardly have been more thorough. The skin tent was slashed beyond mending, the poles were all broken or askew, and the drying racks filled with their jerk meat were completely dismantled. The two boys lay dead, flat on their faces, not far from the teepee. They had been shot while running away, impaled by arrows in their backs. The parents had vanished without a trace. Whether they too had been killed or were taken captive, the two survivors were never to know. They hurriedly covered the bodies of the boys, but this was no time to mourn. Shocked as they were, they could not entertain both grief and fear at the same time. One emotion must wait, and fear took precedence. Lest the Moranderers return and find them, the grandmother decided they must hasten into hiding. She and Bluebird did so, lying concealed under bushes and behind rocks by day, and traveling by night. Under an overcast sky, they lost their way and wandered blindly, with no idea of their destination. The second day at dawn, they happened upon a large camp circle, though it was not theirs, but the people were their kind and spoke their dialect, so they knew they had found refuge. On learning of their plight and their recent tragedy, the magistrate sent the crier out from the council teepee to announce their arrival and rally the people to their aid. The response was quick, and someone gave the newcomers a teepee to live in, while public-spirited collectors carried around the circle a great bull hide into which contributions were placed. The women came running out of their teepees to add their gifts, such as items of clothing and food, and thus all in a day Bluebird and her grandmother were equipped to start life anew. From time to time the wives and mothers of hunters brought them meat, and at the next several festivals they were invited as special guests. In such ways did the people help them re-establish themselves in their new camp circle, and when at last, in the privacy of their newly acquired home, the two could give way to their grief and wail at leisure, their women neighbors came in to wail with them in sympathy, as was the custom, and the members of the camp circle adopted the newcomers as relatives. It was true enough that here Bluebird and her grandmother fell into the category of the humbler folk of the community, without any male relatives to give them backing. They made no pretensions to importance in the social life of the camp circle, nor were they expected to. Nevertheless, their lowly station in no way degraded them in the popular esteem. The Tetons did not have to put on airs in that way. If one's circumstances did not allow it, one did not need to give feast or take part in conspicuous giveaway ceremonies. The grandmother and grandchild, accepting their situation, were content to remain quietly in the background. Since they could not return to the camp circle where they did have position, and with it certain social obligations, it was enough that they had fallen in with their own kind of people, and that had been taken in as relatives in social kinship. As the seasons passed, the young man of the village could not fail to see that Bluebird was maturing, and that her growing beauty was remarkable. But this fact troubled her grandmother greatly, and she felt the need of someone with whom to share the responsibility for the girl until she should be safely married. Knowing well how some reckless young men played at courtship, she feared for Bluebird. She must be warned at once that many a girl had come to ruin by taking their smooth wooing seriously, and the grandmother was the only one to tell her. "I shall have a talk with her tomorrow. But each day she put it off, dreading the ordeal. I am too old for this. Would that her mother were here, she said to herself. Oh, perhaps I should simply give the girl away in marriage now, to some kind and able householder, to be a co-wife. Then she can be honorably married before any trouble can befall her. Yes, that would be best. But just whom to give her to was a puzzle, and what wife would want her? Being a co-wife was not necessarily bad, provided the man was kind. She had been a co-wife herself, but then she was the wife's sister, and therefore was well received. In fact, as she remembered now, it was the elder sister who had offered to take her into the family. But Bluebird had no sister in this camp circle. A head wife might resent her. That too must be considered. Slowly and timidly the old woman turned the problem over in her head many times, but she had not yet acted when Bluebird said to her one day, "Grandmother, one of the young men at the courting place has been urging me to marry him. His name is Star Elk." The old woman shook her head emphatically. No, not that one. It would be good for you to marry, grandchild. We are so alone and helpless without a man to provide for our home, but not that one. Only last night the women around the campfire were talking about him. He is no hunter, they said. He takes no interest in anything. Anyway, he has been headstrong and unfriendly, even as a boy, they said. This is not the kind of man for you, grandchild. But I have told him I would marry him, grandmother. The silence that followed was ominous. When the old woman again found her voice, she said, "Ah, if only you had told me he was courting you, so I could have warned you, grandchild. Since you have promised already, there is nothing I can do." Once she gives it, an honorable Dakota woman does not break her word to a man. Those who make false promises are ever after derided. To give your word is to give yourself. With that, she stumbled out of the little teepee and began to wail in a quavering voice the following lament. "Ah, my son, ah, my daughter-in-law, you have left me alone to struggle on. What can I do? Frail and full of years as I am." Far into the night she wailed. Bluebird's marriage was inevitable now. But even after resigning herself to it, the grandmother went about with a heavy heart. "If only I had had someone to help me arrange a suitable marriage for her," she muttered to herself from time to time. That the girl might run off with Star Elk was a dreaded possibility, even while there was a feeble hope that perhaps the young man had been misinterpreted as altogether undesirable. Perhaps he was not that bad after all, and perhaps he would soon do the honorable thing and marry the girl openly with tribal approval. The most glamorous kind of marriage was by purchase. A woman who married in that way was respected, for it meant that she had kept herself so unattainable that a man who wanted her at all costs thought nothing of giving horses for her, even at the risk of her rejecting him publicly. "I do not aspire to that for my poor orphan grandchild," the grandmother said. "All I ask is a valid marriage, and then I should die happy. She might come to live with them or take her to his people openly, whichever way it should be planned and above board, and then Bluebird would be respected." But Star Elk lived up to his reputation. He lured the girl away, the very thing her grandmother had feared. What a gamble that was. A Teton girl who accepted marriage on such savvy terms took the supreme risk with her honor. How did she know that the man was not just trifling with her? Too often, an elopement ended disastrously for the girl, while the man always went free. Momentarily, the old woman looked for the girl's return. After the man tired of her, she would of course receive her back. Was she not her grandchild? But the disgrace would be lasting. As it happened, though, Bluebird was lucky. Star Oak did not dally on the way, but took her straight home to his people. And for her grandmother, that was the one mitigating fact. Soon the new relatives-in-laws came for her and placed her teepee in among their family group, that they might care for her. Thus, even though Bluebird had married in the least honorable way, the material condition of her grandmother was bettered, and that was something. Because Stark had taken Bluebird home to his people, the marriage was accepted as tolerably valid, and in due time the foolish step was forgiven the girl. The usual sharp censure of the eloping woman was toned down considerably by the circumstances. Condoning it, women began saying, well, what could you expect since the girl is young and pretty and lacks a mother to guide her? What could a tottering grandmother do anyway? It is good that the girl did not get into real trouble and bear a fatherless child. Thus Bluebird, by not being discarded in the wilds, abandoned far from the camp circle, or bearing a fatherless child, came in to be counted among the blameless women of the camp circle, by the slimmest of margins, but she was in. Even so, things were far from ideal. Star Oak was lazy, petulant, and given to Jill's fits. It was his relatives who received her kindly and treated her well, partly for their own reputation as correct in-laws, and partly to compensate for his failures. This made up in a measure for the poor bargain Bluebird had made, but, kind as they were, it might have been better if they had been remiss in some details, or even outright hostile to her. If only her husband had been more satisfactory. The marriage had been unfortunate from the beginning. The teepees of skin were opaque at night, unless the fire was flaming. Occupants must feel their way about. The cousin entered the teepee at a late hour and moved with caution toward her. Perhaps Bluebird was asleep. Nevertheless, she spoke to her softly. Cousin, are you resting well? We shall be by ourselves. I have sent the children and their father to sleep in their mother's teepee. Wake me up at once if you need anything. I am quite all right, cousin, and I think I can sleep now. I was just thinking of the past. That is all. The two women said nothing further. There was in the language no formality equivalent to good night. One quite well indicated one's goodwill and good wishes by tonal quality. After a little, Bluebird reached out drowsily and touched her baby, smiling in the dark as she did so. This is all I wanted, she murmured. Let him do his worst, and presently she slept. How could she guess to what lengths he would go to spite her for staying away?